In Rock Springs, Wyoming, a friendly face was known to all. Rosemary Cooper, 48 years young. With a warm smile that could brighten anyone's day, she was the epitome of community spirit. Neighbors could count on Rosemary for a cheerful chat or a helping hand whenever needed. Her big dreams were matched only by the love of her family and her dedication to local causes. From church events to neighborhood cookouts, Rosemary's presence was a constant, her volunteering efforts tireless. Her amiable disposition endeared her to everyone, making her a beloved figure in the tight-knit Wyoming community. Rosemary lived in a quaint two-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street in Rock Springs, a Cleveland suburb known for its classic architecture and tight-knit community. Rock Springs had a boho chic vibe, with its liberal leanings, a mix of historic and modern homes, local coffee spots, and a lively art scene. Rosemary's home was warm and inviting, filled with family pictures, comfortable furniture, and the smell of cookies that often wafted from her kitchen. She had a love for cooking, and her chocolate chip cookies were a favorite. She frequently brought them to work or shared them with her neighbors. Rosemary's husband, Stephen Cooper, was 16 years younger than her, but despite the age gap, they seemed to have a solid marriage. Stephen worked for a health insurance company and was often tied up with his job, but they made time for each other. Married for 5 years, they lived with Rosemary's daughter from a previous marriage, 19-year-old Sue Kelly Cooper. Sue was a bright college student on a pre-med track aiming to become a doctor. Rosemary took great pride in her daughter's ambitions and supported her however she could. In the weeks before her death, Rosemary had been eagerly planning a family vacation to Orlando. She spoke about the trip often, excited about the time they would spend together. She had recently bought a new suitcase, filling it with summer clothes, sunscreen, and a fresh pair of sandals. Family time meant everything to Rosemary, and she looked forward to the getaway, but Rosemary's excitement would be tragically cut short. On the morning of April 17, 2019, she was found dead in her home, ending the plans and leaving behind unanswered questions. That morning, Rock Springs was just beginning to stir. It was a cool, overcast day, typical for a Wyoming spring. The streets were quiet, with only a few early risers walking their dogs or grabbing a coffee from the nearby Starbucks. Rosemary Cooper, always an early riser herself, didn't seem to follow her usual routine. Around 8:30 a.m., her daughter, 19-year-old Sue Kelly Cooper, came downstairs to the kitchen and made a chilling discovery. Rosemary was lying unresponsive on the floor, a can of her beloved Diet Pepsi spilled beside her. The sticky liquid slowly spread into the cracks between the kitchen tiles. In a panic, Sue screamed and quickly dialed 911, her hands trembling as she pressed the numbers. The dispatcher tried to keep her calm, but Sue was too overwhelmed, crying and pleading for someone to come fast. Paramedics arrived within minutes to find Sue in shock, pacing frantically in the living room. The house was disturbingly silent, except for the faint sound of the ongoing 911 call still playing through Sue's phone, which sat on the kitchen counter. They rushed to Rosemary's side, but it was too late. Rosemary was pronounced dead at the scene. Sue was in disbelief. Just the day before, her mother had been talking excitedly about their vacation, picking out clothes and making plans. Now she was gone, leaving Sue in a whirlwind of confusion and loss. While paramedics attended to the situation, Sue called her stepfather, Stephen Cooper, who was at work at the time. His reaction was immediate and extreme. He began wailing, almost screaming, as Sue sobbed into the phone. He promised to leave work immediately, but his voice was filled with an almost manic grief. The Rock Springs Police Department wasted no time in responding to the Cooper residence. Detective Laura Harris, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years on the force, took charge of the case. Known for her keen eye and precise methods, Harris had a reputation for cracking even the toughest cases. When she stepped into the scene on the morning of April 17, 2019, she immediately sensed something wasn't right. The Cooper house, a typical suburban home with a well-maintained lawn and blooming flower beds, appeared perfectly normal from the outside. Inside, everything was neat and orderly, except for the sight of Rosemary Cooper's body sprawled on the kitchen floor. Next to her lay a can of Diet Pepsi, its contents slowly seeping across the floor. Harris quickly set her team to work, securing the area. Yellow police tape went up around the property, and officers were stationed at the front to keep curious neighbors away. As the investigators combed through the kitchen, they noticed no signs of forced entry or struggle. Everything seemed untouched. Rosemary's purse sat on the counter undisturbed, and the back door was locked from the inside. However, one detail caught Harris's eye. The can of Diet Pepsi was still mostly full, with only a small amount spilled. She made sure the crime scene unit collected the can and its remaining contents as evidence. They also took samples from the floor and counter for further testing in case any unusual substances were present. Photos were taken from every possible angle, capturing every detail of the scene. An autopsy was ordered to determine exactly what had caused Rosemary's sudden death. The paramedics initially suspected a heart attack, but Detective Harris wasn't convinced. Something about Rosemary's position on the floor, combined with the fact that she had been drinking her favorite soda moments before, raised red flags. As the investigation progressed, the detectives scoured the house for more clues. They sifted through Rosemary's belongings, searching for anything that hinted at foul play. Her phone was seized as evidence, with plans to examine her recent calls and messages. Harris understood this case would require a meticulous approach. Rosemary's death was clearly more complex than it appeared on the surface. With Rosemary Cooper's death now under investigation, the focus shifted to those closest to her. The first person detectives interviewed was her husband, Stephen Cooper. At 32, Stephen was significantly younger than Rosemary. He worked in Cleveland for a health insurance company and had built a reputation as a charming, successful man. On the outside, he appeared to have it all: a good job, a comfortable home, and a loving family. But as detectives started digging deeper, another side of Stephen began to emerge. Stephen had met Rosemary 6 years earlier, back when he was a junior analyst at the insurance firm. Rosemary, a widow at the time, was drawn to his youthful energy and self-assurance. A year later, they married, and Stephen took on the role of stepfather to Rosemary's then 13-year-old daughter, Sue. While their marriage seemed stable from the outside, friends had noticed that Stephen had grown distant in the past year. He was staying late at work more often, frequently coming home late or claiming he had business trips. Stephen remained composed, almost cold. Though he expressed shock over Rosemary's death, his reactions seemed strangely muted. He explained to Detective Laura Harris that he had been at work when it happened and rushed home as soon as Sue Calvin had called to inform him. When asked about his relationship with Rosemary, he claimed their marriage had been good, though he admitted they had grown distant over time. He firmly denied any involvement in her death, insisting he had no idea why anyone would want to hurt her. As the interview progressed, Harris's suspicions deepened. Stephen's behavior felt too controlled, too calculated. When questioned about Rosemary's daily plans, his answers were vague. He said he didn't track her activities, citing his feminist beliefs. He couldn't recall the last time they had a meaningful conversation or were intimate as a couple. To Harris, it seemed odd that someone who professed love for his wife was so disconnected from her life. Detectives also picked up on inconsistencies in Stephen's statements. He mentioned knowing that Diet Pepsi was Rosemary's favorite drink, but couldn't explain why a half-empty can was found beside her body. While he claimed Rosemary drank soda regularly, he seemed to lack awareness of her other habits or routines. As the interrogation continued, police began to wonder about Stephen's motive. Did he want out of the marriage, or was there a darker reason behind his actions? The investigation into Stephen's life revealed that he had been keeping secrets. One of the most shocking was his sexual obsession with his stepdaughter, Sue. This new revelation gave the police a fresh angle to investigate. If Stephen had romantic feelings for Sue, it could offer a reason why he might want Rosemary gone. However, proving Stephen's involvement in her death required far more concrete evidence. Detective Harris understood the need for precision, carefully piecing together every detail of the unfolding case. Next on their list of interviews was Sue Kelly Cooper, Rosemary's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. Sue was a focused and ambitious young woman, well on her way to a medical career. As a pre-med student at Case Western Reserve University, she had earned a scholarship for her academic excellence. Known for her kindness and commitment, Sue spent much of her time volunteering at hospitals and tutoring underprivileged students, common in the community of Rock Springs. Outside of her studies, Sue deeply admired her mother, viewing Rosemary as a figure of strength and compassion. They shared an incredibly close bond, often spending weekends shopping, watching movies, or having deep conversations while snuggled together. Rosemary had always been Sue's biggest supporter, especially after the loss of Sue's biological father when she was just a child. This loss had forged an unbreakable connection between them, making Rosemary's sudden death even more devastating for Sue. When detectives first approached Sue, she was visibly overwhelmed by grief. The trauma of losing her mother, compounded by the shock of finding her body, had shaken her to the core. Sue explained that she had been studying for an upcoming biology exam when she decided to take a break and grab a snack. Upon entering the kitchen, she found her mother lying on the floor, unresponsive, with a can of Diet Pepsi nearby. In a panic, she called 911, desperate to believe it wasn't already too late. During the interview, Sue was cooperative but visibly emotional. She described her mother's recent mood as joyful and content, with no indication of stress or unhappiness. Sue couldn't think of anyone who would wish harm on Rosemary, emphasizing that her mother was well loved by everyone who knew her. When detectives inquired about her relationship with her stepfather, Stephen, Sue spoke fondly of him, calling him a hottie and seeing him as a supportive father figure. She was completely unaware of Stephen's hidden sexual obsession with her, a fact that heightened the detectives' concerns and raised their suspicions. As investigators dug further into Sue's life, they found no evidence linking her to her mother's death. Her alibi held up. Sue had been in her room, deeply focused on her studies at the time of the murder. Her social media reflected the typical life of a college student, filled with posts about school, friends, political causes, and upcoming exams. There were no signs of secret relationships or any troubling behavior. However, the police were still suspicious of the dynamics within the Cooper household. They wondered if Sue could have been an unknowing pawn in Stephen's plan. If Stephen's sexual obsession with Sue was as intense as they suspected, it could mean that Sue was in danger too. However, there was no evidence linking Sue to the crime, prompting detectives to shift their focus elsewhere. Next, the police questioned Jessica Miller, Rosemary's closest friend and confidant. Jessica, 45, worked as a real estate agent and had known Rosemary for over a decade. Their bond was strong, forged through shared experiences as working women in the Rock Springs community, making them practically inseparable. Jessica was a frequent presence at Rosemary's home, often helping with neighborhood events or simply unwinding with a glass of wine in the evenings. To those who knew them, their friendship seemed solid, built on trust and mutual respect. But investigators soon uncovered a shocking truth. Jessica had been hiding a secret. She was having an affair with Stephen Cooper. This revelation stunned everyone familiar with the trio, especially considering Jessica's close relationship with Rosemary. According to Jessica, the affair started roughly a year before Rosemary's death. She claimed it began innocently, with Stephen attending one of her notorious naked hot tub parties. A few flirtatious exchanges quickly escalated into a full-blown sexual affair. Jessica confessed to feeling a little guilty about betraying her friend, but admitted she couldn't resist Stephen's smoking hot body. When detectives interviewed Jessica, she appeared nervous and defensive. She understood that her affair with Stephen made her a person of interest, but she firmly denied any involvement in Rosemary's death. Jessica claimed to be deeply saddened by Rosemary's death and even considered cutting back on her weekly sexual encounters with Stephen, overwhelmed by guilt. Yet she also revealed that Stephen had recently told her he was in love with someone else, which left her feeling devastated. Though she didn't know the identity of the other woman, Jessica suspected it could be someone younger, possibly Sue. Detectives pressed her for more details about her relationship with Stephen and her activities on the day of Rosemary's death. Jessica explained that she had been at a real estate showing in Cleveland Heights and had clients who could back up her alibi. The police followed up, verifying that Jessica was indeed with her clients at the time of the murder. However, they couldn't completely rule out the possibility of her involvement, considering the emotional turmoil and jealousy she might have felt over Stephen's shifting affections. Despite her alibi, Jessica remained a person of interest in the case. Her affair with Stephen, combined with her close friendship with Rosemary, made Jessica a complicated figure in the investigation. Detectives had to question whether her jealousy and heartbreak could have pushed her to take drastic action. But without direct evidence tying her to the crime, Jessica's situation remained precarious, trapped between the guilt of her affair and the sorrow of losing her friend. On April 27, 2019, just after 9 a.m., Rock Springs was shrouded in the cool, overcast weather typical of Wyoming in the spring. As investigators continued their search for answers, they received a critical breakthrough. A toxicology report from the lab revealed that Rosemary Cooper had been killed by cyanide poisoning. The deadly substance had been mixed into her Diet Pepsi, confirming that her death was not from natural causes but a calculated act of murder. The discovery that cyanide had been used as the murder weapon stunned the investigation team. Cyanide, a rare and lethal poison, is more commonly linked to espionage cases than domestic murders. Detectives realized they were dealing with a carefully planned and executed crime. Whoever was responsible had gone to extreme lengths to carry out Rosemary's killing. This new evidence shifted the entire investigation, providing detectives with a clearer path forward. Immediately, detectives revisited the crime scene, now with a renewed focus on finding any trace of the poison or clues on how it had been introduced into Rosemary's drink. They re-examined the Diet Pepsi can, the surrounding kitchen area, and any objects that could have come into contact with the cyanide. Forensic specialists were brought in to analyze everything from the remnants of the drink to the fingerprints on the can. Although no cyanide residue was found in the kitchen itself, forensic experts detected traces of the poison on the rim of the can, confirming that it had been deliberately laced. This raised even more troubling questions. Who had access to cyanide, and how did they manage to slip it into Rosemary's drink unnoticed? Investigators began to dig into the backgrounds of every suspect, looking for any history of chemical expertise or access to dangerous substances. They combed through recent purchases, online searches, and any activity that might suggest someone had been researching or obtaining cyanide. Detectives knew that cyanide wasn't something easily acquired. Whoever had used it had likely done careful and deliberate planning. The new evidence turned up the heat on the suspects. Detectives brought them back in for questioning, focusing on their knowledge of poisons and any strange behavior leading up to Rosemary's death. Their goal was to uncover who had both the means and motive to carry out such a calculated act. Now that the case clearly pointed to murder, the investigation gained a sense of urgency as they pushed closer to uncovering the truth. On April 29, 2019, just before noon, the police made a critical breakthrough that would lead them directly to the killer. After meticulously reviewing the evidence and conducting more interviews, detectives began to unravel a disturbing narrative. Everything pointed to Stephen Cooper, Rosemary's husband, as the one behind her death. Stephen, 32, was outwardly a charismatic, successful man working in health insurance. From the outside, he seemed to have it all: a good job, a beautiful wife, and a seemingly perfect life in Rock Springs. But underneath that polished exterior, Stephen was consumed by dark and twisted sexual obsessions. Stephen had developed a disturbing sexual obsession with his stepdaughter, Sue Kelly Cooper, from Rosemary's previous marriage. Secretly, he harbored these feelings for 19-year-old Sue, who had no idea of his intentions. As his fixation grew, Stephen became increasingly distant from Rosemary, viewing her as the obstacle standing in the way of his twisted fantasy of being with Sue. Detectives uncovered critical evidence that directly linked Stephen to the murder. A thorough analysis of his internet search history revealed months of research on cyanide, showing he had been looking into how to buy it, use it, and its lethal effects on the body. This damning evidence indicated that Stephen had meticulously planned the murder using cyanide to kill Rosemary and leave no obvious trace behind. On the day of Rosemary's murder, Stephen exploited her predictable routine. He knew she had a habit of drinking a Diet Pepsi every evening after work. According to the investigation, Stephen spiked her soda with cyanide, fully aware she would drink it as soon as she arrived home. The poison acted swiftly, causing Rosemary to collapse and die within minutes. His plan was to make it seem like a sudden heart attack, but the toxicology report exposed the truth behind his calculated act. When the police confronted Stephen with the overwhelming evidence, he initially maintained his innocence. However, as detectives presented the damning facts, his internet searches, his growing obsession with Sue, and the cyanide traces found on the can, Stephen's composure began to unravel. His eventual arrest sent shockwaves through the Rock Springs community. Rosemary's friends and neighbors were horrified when they learned that the man they had once seen as a devoted husband had committed such a brutal crime. Sue was left devastated, struggling to comprehend that the man she had viewed as a father figure had been secretly plotting her mother's death. The trial of Stephen Cooper began on January 15, 2019 in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. The case drew widespread media coverage, with local news outlets extensively reporting on the proceedings. Rosemary Cooper's murder had shaken the Rock Springs community, and many followed the trial closely, hoping for justice. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney James Leakey, 45, was known for his methodical and relentless approach to criminal cases. Leakey laid out a strong case against Stephen, arguing that he had meticulously planned Rosemary's murder. He pointed to the cyanide found in her Diet Pepsi and Stephen's damning internet search history on the poison. Leakey described Stephen's actions as cold and calculated, driven by his twisted obsession with Sue. On the defense side, Stephen's attorney, Laura Phillips, 38, tried to present a different narrative. She argued that Stephen was a man overwhelmed by personal stress and emotional problems, which clouded his judgment. Phillips claimed that Stephen's actions were not premeditated, suggesting mental instability played a role. She also attempted to cast doubt on the evidence, arguing that it wasn't sufficient to directly link Stephen to the poisoning, but the sheer weight of evidence against him made that a difficult case to argue. Throughout the trial, Rosemary's family, including Sue, attended every day, visibly shaken and emotionally distraught. Sue, in particular, struggled with the overwhelming reality of her stepfather's betrayal and her mother's tragic death. The court heard tearful testimonies from Rosemary's friends and colleagues, painting a picture of a loving, compassionate woman who never could have anticipated such a violent end. After days of testimony and evidence, the jury returned its verdict on January 22, 2019. Stephen Cooper was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Rosemary's family and friends, the sentencing brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. While justice had been served, the pain of losing Rosemary and the betrayal by Stephen left deep emotional scars. The verdict brought closure to the legal case, but it left lasting effects on those involved. Rosemary's loved ones were left to navigate life without her, remembering the warmth and kindness she had brought to their lives while grappling with the trauma of the trial. The trial served as a harsh reminder of the darkness that can exist behind seemingly perfect lives. After Stephen Cooper's sentencing, Rock Springs slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the emotional toll of the case lingered. The Cooper family was shattered, and the community was left to reckon with the haunting reality of the crime that had unfolded in their midst.